The first crack in the glass came when Michael found a text message on Sarah's phone late one Friday night. He hadn't been snooping, not at all. Her phone had buzzed on the kitchen counter, and when he glanced over to see if it was something important, he caught a single word glowing on the screen: tonight. It wasn't the message itself that set off alarms in Michael's head, it was the name attached to it: James. Michael didn't know anyone named James in Sarah's life, at least not well enough for her to be meeting him at night. They had been married for 8 years, and though things weren't perfect, he had always thought their love was strong enough to weather anything. The thought that she might be hiding something hadn't even occurred to him. Until now. "Hey, who's James?" he asked casually when she came back into the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel after putting their daughter, Emily, to bed. Sarah froze for a split second, her eyes darting to her phone. "Oh, just someone from work. He's helping me with that big project I told you about." Her answer came quickly, almost too quickly. Michael nodded slowly, letting her words settle. He wanted to believe her. He really did. But something about the way her voice edged just slightly higher, the way she didn't quite meet his gaze, put a seed of doubt in his mind. The next few days passed like normal, or as close to normal as possible when you're trying to convince yourself that your wife has nothing to hide. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Sarah was on edge, her phone glued to her hand more than usual, her laughter a little too forced when they talked. It wasn't until 2 weeks later, when she came home later than she'd promised from a supposed work dinner, that Michael's suspicions solidified into something heavier, something undeniable. Her perfume lingered stronger than usual when she walked through the door, and there was a faint smear of lipstick on the collar of her blouse, a shade she didn't wear. Michael didn't confront her that night. He wasn't the type to make accusations without proof, and he wasn't ready to believe that the woman he loved more than anything could betray him. But he knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. The following weekend, while Sarah was out shopping with friends, Michael decided to dig deeper. He hated himself for it, hated feeling like the kind of husband who would invade his wife's privacy. But he needed answers. He started with her laptop, scrolling through her emails and work files. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but then he found an archived message thread between Sarah and James. The subject line read, "Can't stop thinking about last night." Michael's hands shook as he opened the email. The words inside were a knife to his chest. James had written about their night together in vivid detail, talking about how he couldn't wait to see her again. Sarah's response was just as damning, expressing how much she missed him, how she couldn't wait for their next work trip. Michael closed the laptop and sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. For hours he sat there, replaying their life together in his mind. All the moments he thought were real, the love he thought was mutual, they all felt like lies now. The woman he had loved deeply, supported through every struggle, shared a life and a child with, had been betraying him. When Sarah came home that evening, Michael didn't say anything right away. Instead, he watched her closely, studying the way she moved around the house, the way she kissed their daughter goodnight. How could she act so normal, so loving, when she had been sneaking around behind his back? The confrontation came a week later. Michael spent the time in between gathering everything he needed: messages, emails, even photos he managed to pull from her phone while she was asleep. He wanted to be prepared, to have every piece of evidence laid out so she couldn't lie her way out of it. It was a quiet Tuesday night when he finally brought it up. Emily was asleep, and they were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, the TV playing some mindless sitcom neither of them was paying attention to. "Sarah," Michael said, his voice low and steady. She looked up from her phone. "Yeah. I know about James?" Her face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks so quickly it was almost comical. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. "Don't bother denying it," Michael continued, pulling his phone from his pocket. He opened the folder where he had saved everything and handed it to her. "I have the messages, the emails. I know what you've been doing." Sarah stared at the screen, her hands trembling. "Michael, don't. Just don't," he snapped, his voice laced with anger. "I don't want to hear your excuses. Do you have any idea what you've done? To me? To Emily? To our family?" Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but Michael didn't care. He had no sympathy for her, not after everything he'd uncovered. "I gave you everything," he said, his voice rising. "I loved you more than anything. And this is how you repay me? By screwing around with some guy from work." "Michael, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It wasn't." "Don't you dare say it wasn't serious," he cut her off. "You don't get to downplay this. You don't get to act like it's nothing after you've been lying to my face for months." Sarah broke down, sobbing into her hands, but Michael felt nothing but anger. He had spent so long putting her happiness above his own, sacrificing so much to make their life together work. And now, all of it felt meaningless. "I hope he was worth it," he said coldly, standing up and grabbing his car keys. "Because you just lost everything." Michael didn't return home that night. Instead, he spent hours driving aimlessly, the weight of rage and betrayal pressing down on his chest like a heavy stone. He parked in a dark lot near the waterfront, the distant hum of the city in his ears, and stared blankly at the dashboard. His mind raced, replaying Sarah's sobbing face over and over, but her tears meant nothing to him now. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done, she was sorry she got caught. By the time the first hints of dawn painted the horizon, Michael had made his decision. There would be no second chances, no counseling sessions, no attempts to repair the irreparable. Sarah had made her choice, and now he was going to make his. When he walked through the door that morning, Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, her face blotchy and her eyes swollen from crying. The sight of her only fueled his anger further. "Michael," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "Save it," he snapped, cutting her off. He tossed his phone onto the table. "I've already contacted a lawyer. I'm filing for divorce." Her eyes widened, and for a split second she looked like she might argue. But then her shoulders sagged, and she let out a shaky breath. "We can't just throw everything away," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, Michael. Think about Emily." "I am thinking about Emily," he shot back, his voice sharp. "I'm thinking about how I don't want her to grow up in a house where her mother lies and cheats. Do you even realize what you've done?" "I made a mistake," she said, her voice cracking. "It was a stupid, horrible mistake, but it didn't mean anything." "Don't you dare lie to me again," Michael barked, slamming his hands down on the table. "I saw the messages, Sarah. I read every disgusting word. It didn't mean anything. You told him you loved him." Sarah flinched, her face crumpling as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I didn't mean it," she whispered. "I was confused, Confused." Michael's laugh was cold and bitter. "You weren't confused when you snuck around behind my back, when you lied to my face every single day. Don't try to spin this, Sarah. You don't get to play the victim here." She buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled but still audible. Michael stood there for a moment, watching her crumble, and felt nothing but hollow contempt. "I'll be staying in the guest room until I can find a place," he said finally, his tone flat. "But don't think for a second that I'm going to let you drag this out. We're done. You can explain this to Emily however you see fit, but don't you dare try to paint me as the bad guy." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Sarah to cry alone at the table. Over the next few weeks, Michael moved with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He met with his lawyer, gathered all the evidence of Sarah's infidelity, and began the process of dividing their assets. He kept his interactions with Sarah brief and cold, refusing to engage in any conversations beyond what was absolutely necessary. Sarah, for her part, seemed to exist in a state of quiet desperation. She tried to talk to him a few times, but each attempt ended with Michael shutting her down before she could even finish a sentence. The sight of her disgusted him now, and he couldn't bear to hear her excuses. The only thing that kept him grounded was Emily. He made a point to spend as much time with her as possible, taking her to the park, helping her with her homework, and tucking her in at night. He knew she didn't fully understand what was happening, but she could sense the tension between her parents. The thought of her being caught in the middle of this mess made his stomach churn, but he was determined to shield her from the worst of it. One evening, as Michael was reading Emily a bedtime story, she looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Daddy, why are you and Mommy mad at each other?" Michael's heart clenched, but he forced a smile. "Sometimes grown-ups have problems, sweetie," he said gently. "But that doesn't change how much we both love you. You know that, right?" Emily nodded, though her expression was uncertain. Are you going to leave like Tommy's dad did? Michael hesitated, the question hitting him like a punch to the gut. I don't know what's going to happen, he admitted after a long pause. But I promise you this, I'm always going to be here for you, no matter what. It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was the only one he could give her. The final confrontation came 3 weeks later, when Michael returned home from work to find Sarah in the living room, her suitcase by the door. She stood there, her arms crossed and her face set in a mixture of defiance and anguish. I talked to James, she said without preamble. Michael raised an eyebrow, unbothered. Good for you. He told me you called his wife, she continued, her voice shaking with anger. You had no right to involve her in this. Michael crossed his arms, his gaze icy. She deserved to know the truth, just like I did. If you have a problem with that, maybe you should have thought about it before you decided to destroy 2 families. Sarah's glare faltered, and she looked down at the floor. I'm leaving, she said after a long silence. I'll stay with my sister for a while. Michael nodded, his expression unreadable. Fine. Don't expect me to stop you. She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with something that might have been regret. I'm sorry, Michael, she said quietly. For everything. Michael stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. Sorry doesn't fix this, he said finally. It doesn't undo what you did. I'll never forgive you for what you've done to me, to Emily. I hope it was worth it, Sarah, because you've lost everything. She flinched, and for the first time, Michael thought she might actually understand the depth of her betrayal. Without another word, she picked up her suitcase and walked out the door. The sound of it closing behind her was a bittersweet relief. In the months that followed, Michael finalized the divorce and threw himself into building a new life for himself and Emily. He found a smaller house not far from her school, started going to therapy to work through his anger, and even reconnected with a few old friends he'd lost touch with over the years. Slowly but surely he began to feel like himself again. As for Sarah, the last he heard, she was struggling. James had left her shortly after his wife found out about the affair, and Sarah's attempts to rebuild her life seemed to be floundering. Michael didn't take any satisfaction in her misery, but he also didn't waste any time dwelling on it. She was no longer his concern. For the first time in years, Michael felt free. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, he knew one thing for sure: he and Emily were going to be okay. Michael sat in the lawyer's office, thumbing through a set of documents. The word divorce felt like a brand on his chest, searing and permanent. His attorney, Lisa, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned against the edge of her desk, waiting for his response. This clause here, Michael said, pointing at a section. You're saying she still gets half the house? Lisa nodded. Standard division of marital property. Unless we can test it with the evidence of infidelity you've provided. It's a strong case, but it'll drag things out in court. Your call. Michael leaned back in the chair, his jaw clenching. He hadn't fought this hard just to hand over half the life he'd built to the woman who had destroyed it. Drag it out. I'm not giving her a single thing she doesn't deserve. Lisa smirked. Good choice. I'll file the updated motion today. As he left the office, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number lit up the screen. We need to talk. It's about Sarah. Michael froze mid-step. His grip tightened around the phone as he stared at the message. His first instinct was to ignore it. He wasn't interested in any more drama. But something about the wording felt urgent. Against his better judgment, he replied. Who is this? The response came almost immediately. James. Michael exhaled sharply, his body tensing. After a moment, he typed back, Why would I want to talk to you? Because you don't know everything. Michael's hand shook as he typed his reply, Meet me at the coffee shop on 5th. 1 hour. When James arrived, Michael was already sitting at a corner table, a cup of coffee untouched in front of him. James looked different than Michael had imagined. He wasn't particularly tall or imposing, just an average guy with a nervous energy about him. He hesitated near the entrance before spotting Michael and walking over. Michael didn't stand up. He didn't even gesture for James to sit. Instead, he leveled him with a cold stare. You've got 5 minutes. Talk. James pulled out the chair across from him, his hands fidgeting as he sat down. "I'm not here to defend what I did," he began, his voice low. "I know I screwed up. But Sarah, she wasn't honest with me either." Michael crossed his arms, his expression blank but his eyes sharp. "And why should I care? You both lied, cheated, and wrecked two families. What could you possibly say to make this any worse?" James swallowed hard, his gaze darting around the room before settling back on Michael. "She told me you two were already separated." Michael's brow furrowed, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "Excuse me." "She said you were staying together for your daughter, but that it was over between you," James explained, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't know she was lying until I saw the messages you sent to my wife. That's when I figured out she'd been playing both of us." Michael's hands curled into fists on the table, but he kept his voice low and controlled. "So, what? You're saying you're a victim too? Spare me." James shook his head. "I'm not looking for sympathy. I just thought you should know. She had me convinced that she was trapped in a loveless marriage, that you were emotionally distant and didn't care about her anymore." Michael let out a bitter laugh. "And you believed her? Without ever asking questions, without wondering why she was sneaking around? You're as pathetic as she is." James flinched but didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Here," he said, sliding it across the table. "This is the address of the hotel where we met. I thought you might want it for your case." Michael stared at the paper for a long moment before snatching it off the table. "Get out," he said, his voice cold and final. James stood up, hesitating as if he wanted to say more, but Michael's glare stopped him. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the cafe. Michael sat there for a while, staring at the address on the paper. He felt no satisfaction, no vindication, just a deep, simmering rage that coursed through his veins like fire. That evening, he confronted Sarah again. She was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when Michael stormed in and slammed the paper down on the counter. "Care to explain this?" he demanded. Sarah froze, her knife hovering mid-air. Her eyes flicked to the paper, and her face paled. "What is that?" "Don't play dumb," Michael snapped. "It's the address of the hotel where you and James played house. He told me everything, including the lies you fed him about our marriage." Sarah set the knife down, her hands trembling. "Michael, Save it," he barked, his voice echoing through the kitchen. "You told him we were separated? That I didn't care about you? Do you have any idea how disgusting that is?" Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but Michael didn't relent. "You didn't just betray me, you dragged my name through the mud to justify your affair. And for what? So you could feel better about what you were doing? Pathetic?" "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael laughed bitterly. "You didn't mean for it? That's your excuse? You lied to him, you lied to me, and you lied to yourself. And now you're standing here, expecting me to what? Forgive you." Sarah shook her head, her tears falling freely now. "No, I just want a chance to fix this." "There's nothing to fix," Michael said coldly. "The only thing left to do is finish this divorce and figure out how to move on. Separately." Sarah crumpled onto a chair, her sobs filling the room, but Michael didn't waver. He turned and walked away, leaving her to face the consequences of her actions alone. 2 weeks later, Michael stood in the courthouse, signing the final papers that would sever their marriage. Sarah didn't meet his eyes once during the proceedings, her face pale and drawn. When it was over, Michael walked out of the building without looking back. As he stepped into the sunlight, a sense of relief washed over him. He had lost something precious, but he had also gained something invaluable, a second chance to build a life on his own terms. For the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe again. The next weekend, Michael was packing boxes in the garage when he heard Sarah's voice behind him. He didn't bother turning around. Just hearing her tone a mix of desperation and hesitation was enough to sour his mood. "We need to talk, Michael," she said quietly. "I have nothing to say to you," he replied without looking up, stacking another box on the growing pile near the door. "It's about Emily." Her words stopped him in his tracks. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. What about her? He asked, his voice clipped. Sarah wrung her hands, shifting uncomfortably under his glare. She's been asking questions. She wants to know why you're so angry all the time, why we don't eat dinner together anymore. I don't know what to tell her. Michael's jaw tightened. You tell her the truth, Sarah. Tell her that her mother couldn't keep her vows, that she lied and cheated and destroyed this family. Or would that be too inconvenient for you? Sarah flinched, her face crumpling. Michael, please. She's just a child. She doesn't understand. Exactly, he cut her off, his voice rising. She's a child, and she deserves better than the mess you've made of her family. So maybe instead of trying to manipulate me into softening the blow for you, you should think about how to explain your actions to her. Sarah's lips trembled, but she didn't argue. She looked down, her hands twisting together. I know I messed up, she said after a long silence. But I'm trying, Michael. I'm trying to make things right. Michael shook his head, his anger simmering just below the surface. You don't get to make things right, Sarah. Not with me. The only thing you can do now is try not to screw up Emily's life any more than you already have. She opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of a car pulling into the driveway cut her off. Michael turned to see his sister Laura stepping out of her SUV. She waved as she approached, her expression curious. Everything okay here? Laura asked, glancing between them. Fine, Michael said shortly, moving to grab another box. Sarah was just leaving. Sarah hesitated, her gaze lingering on him for a moment, but then she nodded and walked back toward the house. Laura waited until she was out of earshot before speaking. Still a little tense. Huh, she said, leaning against the doorframe. Michael snorted. That's putting it lightly. What are you doing here? I came to see how you're holding up, Laura said, her tone softening, and to see if you needed help with the move. Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm fine. Just trying to get everything sorted before the movers come on Monday. Laura watched him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she crossed her arms. You don't have to do this alone. I'm not alone, Michael said, gesturing to the boxes. I have plenty of people offering to help me pack. That's not what I meant, Laura said gently. I mean with everything. The divorce, Emily, starting over. You don't have to pretend like you're okay all the time. Michael paused, his hands resting on the edge of a box. For a moment, he considered brushing her off, but the concern in her eyes stopped him. He exhaled slowly, the weight of the past few months pressing down on him. I'm doing the best I can, he admitted, his voice quieter. But it's not easy. Every time I look at Emily, I see what she's lost because of Sarah's choices. I don't know how to fix that. Laura stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to fix everything, Michael. You just have to be there for her. And from what I've seen, you're doing a damn good job of that. Michael nodded, his throat tight. He wasn't used to showing vulnerability, but Laura's words were a small comfort. Thanks, he said gruffly. Laura smiled. Anytime. The next morning, Michael was in the middle of loading the last of the boxes into his truck when his phone buzzed. He pulled it out, frowning at the unfamiliar number. Hello, he said cautiously. Mr. Carter? This is Melissa Jennings. I'm James's wife. Michael stiffened, the name sending a jolt through him. What do you want? He asked, his tone wary. I thought you should know something, Melissa said, her voice steady but tense. Sarah reached out to James last night. She wanted to meet up. Michael's grip on the phone tightened. Why are you telling me this? Because I think you deserve to know exactly who you're dealing with, Melissa said. She hasn't let go of him, Michael. She's still trying to keep him in her life, even after everything that's happened. Michael closed his eyes, his free hand clenching into a fist. He had thought he was done with Sarah's lies and manipulations, but this was a new low, even for her. Thanks for letting me know, he said, his voice cold. I'll take care of it. After hanging up, Michael didn't waste any time. He marched back into the house, where Sarah was sitting at the dining table with Emily, helping her with a school project. We need to talk, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Sarah looked up, her expression wary. Can it wait? I'm in the middle of something with Emily. No, Michael said firmly. It can't. Emily looked between them, her brow furrowing. Is everything okay? Go to your room, sweetie, Michael said gently. I'll come talk to you in a little bit. Emily hesitated, clearly sensing the tension, but she nodded and gathered her things before heading upstairs. As soon as she was out of earshot, Michael turned back to Sarah. Why are you still contacting James? He demanded. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. I'm not. Don't lie to me, Michael snapped, slamming his hand on the table. I just got off the phone with his wife. She told me everything. Sarah's face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, she said, her voice muffled. I didn't know what else to do. Michael stared at her, his anger boiling over. You didn't know what else to do? How about leaving him alone? How about focusing on your daughter instead of chasing after a man who clearly doesn't want anything to do with you? Sarah looked up, her eyes red and swollen. I'm sorry, Michael. I know I've made mistakes, but... No, Michael said, cutting her off. You don't get to apologize anymore. You've destroyed everything, Sarah. And the worst part is, you don't even seem to care. Sarah broke down in tears, but Michael didn't stay to watch. He turned and walked out of the house, slamming the door behind him. By the time he returned later that evening, Sarah was gone. A note on the counter said she was staying with her sister for a while. Michael crumpled it in his hand and tossed it in the trash. For the first time since the nightmare began, he felt a sense of peace.